Conducting research in the field of psychology is not without its challenges. This video will work through some general problems we may encounter in our studies and how we can attempt to solve those concerns. You'll probably start to notice that some solutions help address multiple problems. The first problem we will consider is called sample bias. This occurs when we have a problem related to who is in our study. Oftentimes, sample bias means that our sample, or the participants in the study, do not adequately represent our population, or the larger body of people we are trying to understand. Being thoughtful about our sampling methods can help address this. For instance, I could use random sampling, which entails randomly drawing from our larger population, attempting to give all individuals within the population an equal chance of being part of the sample. However, this can be pretty impractical, especially if my population is all human beings. As this example illustrates, there is no perfect sampling method. Each has its advantages and flaws that we need to be mindful of. Given we are bringing up the issue of who is in our sample, we need to consider the problem of ethnocentrism. This issue arises when we assume our cultural values and norms are shared by others, thus overshadowing other cultures. Or we use our own culture's values and norms to judge others, generally concluding ours is the correct or best culture and delegating others as wrong or inferior. Although ethnocentrism can manifest in a range of ways in our study, a common demonstration of ethnocentrism ties back to sample bias. When we recruit from a single culture, we cannot assume the findings in those studies generalize to other cultures. The solution is to recruit across cultures. This is called cross-cultural sampling, and in fact is really another type of sampling method. It allows us not only to test whether our findings generalize across cultures, but also consider important and meaningful cultural differences. Remember, after all, psychology is a social and behavioral science. As such, we are curious about the intersections of human behavior and cultural norms. Now, ethnocentrism doesn't always manifest itself through sampling issues. Sometimes it's a matter of how the research develops and is conducted. Which brings us to the problem of experimenter bias, along with observer bias. In each case, we are talking about problems with the people who are conducting the study or collecting the data, respectively. One of the solutions we could turn to is called the double-blind method, or double-blind study. The double-blind method ensures that the researcher who has direct interaction with participants, or responsibility for coding data, doesn't know which participants are in which condition, hearkening back to the distinction between control and experimental groups. By keeping a researcher uninformed about participants' randomly assigned conditions, we reduce potential expectations of that researcher, which may inadvertently influence their behaviors or interpretations of data. Keep in mind, although the researcher or observer lacks this knowledge, someone is indeed keeping track of what participants are in the control group and what participants are in each of the experimental groups. Beyond our researchers or observers creating potential problems in our study, the participants themselves can cause some concerns. We call this participant bias. Be careful to distinguish this from sample bias. Remember that sample bias is about who was recruited to be in the sample or participate in the study. Participant bias speaks to problems after we've recruited participants and once they are actually participating in the study. One example of participant bias is when participants lie about a response. Participants may lie for a variety of reasons, including to look good, to help the researcher, and because they just don't know the answer. For instance, if I ask students in a study, how many hours do you spend studying for Psych 100 every week? I'm likely to get an inflated number. Some people may want to make it look like they study a lot, so they report a higher number. Some people think I, as the researcher, expect them to provide a higher number. And some people, perhaps most people, don't have an accurate measure of the exact number of hours they spend studying for one class, so they guess, and just make something up that sounds kind of good. There are a couple of potential ways for dealing with this participant bias. One of them is called single-blind method or single-blind study. It's like the watered-down version of the double-blind study. Like the double-blind study, the single-blind method keeps participants unaware of what condition they are in. So, in a sense, it's not far off from our other solution, which is deception. In the case of research, deception can be used to reduce the impact of participants' expectations and biases. Hopefully, you can appreciate that there's an irony that in science, we may lie to keep people from lying. Now, one way that scientists differ in their use of deception is that we do eventually come clean. If we use deception in a study, we must inform participants of this during the debriefing, or the period after participants have completed their participation in the study. Our last two problems came up specifically in relation to cross-sectional versus longitudinal studies. Cross-sectional studies specifically encounter the problem of cohort effects, which are generational differences that are introduced when we compare groups of people representing different ages. You see, if we compare a group of 20-year-olds to a group of 40-year-olds, there's more than just 20 years of age difference. The world that those 20-year-olds grew up in is just a different world than what those 40-year-olds grew up in. Cohort effects create a confounding variable in cross-sectional studies. Any observed differences in cross-sectional studies might be due to age, but they might also be due to social and cultural differences between our cohorts. And attrition occurs with longitudinal studies. It speaks to the problems of participants dropping out of the study before the study is done. This problem means that attrition also creates a confounding variable in longitudinal studies. Any observed differences may be due to people getting older, or may be due to people being able to remain in the study for the entire time. For these last two problems, what is a problem for one is a solution for the other, meaning that the way to avoid cohort effects is to conduct a longitudinal study, and the way to avoid attrition is to conduct cross-sectional studies. Which actually illustrates a nice takeaway. There is no such thing as a flawless study. All studies will have some problems. We can attempt to avoid certain problems, or at least reduce the influence of those problems, but often other problems arise. That means that any single study cannot tell us everything we need to know. We will always need to replicate to ensure the reliability of our results, and to make modifications to the study as we minimize problems with past studies in future studies. Think of it this way. Every study we conduct is a single puzzle piece. It doesn't give us the whole picture, but when we put it together with other studies from within the field of psychology, as well as beyond psychology, we begin to get a fuller understanding of the complexities of human behavior.